if you are rooting for the state to imprison software developers because they are using a different preferred consensus node software than your preferred, might be time to take a minute off and look yourself in the mirror and be like, all right, what am I fighting for here? There are going to be parallels in the way the state wants to regulate open source AI, and the way that we think about and frame this question now about where is the line between neutral infrastructure and then criminal activity we're scared about, I suspect even outside of Bitcoin and crypto is going to be one of the defining questions of this century because of the way AI is developing.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Policy Hour. This is a weekly show talking about Bitcoin policy, policy at large. Always got a little bit of AI talk in here. So Kyle, our guest today, you're going to have to watch out for that. But yeah, just going to introduce y'all. We got Zach Shapiro here, BPI's head of policy, and special guest this week, Kyle Olney, the co-founder of Save Our Wallets, which we'll get into a little bit more. As always, Zach Cohen here, an associate with the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And this week, we're gonna have Kyle on here to talk about a new campaign that the Bitcoin Policy Institute just launched. It's called the Satoshi Needs You campaign. And yeah, we're just gonna kind of dig into the details here. So Kyle, let's kick us off here. Can you foreground a little bit what Save Our Wallets is, why it was started, and kind of the intended outcomes of that larger push?
Yeah, thanks, Zach, and glad to be here and talking to everybody on the Policy Hour. So, Save Our Wallets is a campaign that we launched at the beginning of the year in order to help promote engagement in the larger Bitcoin community around the legislative process that's ongoing this year through Congress. There's a big market structure bill and a series of other Bitcoin policy initiatives that are ongoing. But the Clarity Act in particular, which is now the kind of market structure bill that contains the necessary stuff that we care about in kind of the Bitcoin ecosystem for developer freedom, has been a major focus for us this year. And as we move into the home stretch on the markup with the bill, as it's moving through Congress, it's already passed the House, it's now in the Senate. We'll be coming to a floor vote, hopefully, in the next couple months here. We really wanted to reignite everybody's attention in the community around the importance of, us being able to maintain access to the wallets and, kind of non-custodial peer-to-peer technology that has been so critical to, Bitcoin for its entire existence for the last 16 years. And at the moment, we have very strong protections in the Clarity Act that came from the BRCA bill that was originally proposed at the beginning of this legislative session. But as we've seen with, Congress over the years, there are no guarantees on what will end up in the final bill as it comes to, a floor vote. Oftentimes the way these things happen, it's 11th hour, people haven't had a chance to read it, et cetera, et cetera. We just, as Bitcoiners, we were critical in making, the decision about who's going to win the presidential election. We just really want to make sure that people stay engaged in this fight and make sure that we get the, the guidelines and legal frameworks in place that are going to protect the Bitcoin we know and love as we move forward. So happy to talk more about the, kind of campaign itself, but hopefully that's a good background to start people off if they were unfamiliar.
Yeah, that's great. Kyle, forgive me for jumping right into this, but also kind of curious on your background, what you did before this, what you're working on now, and mostly curious, like what caused you to start this campaign?
Yeah, so I'm a longtime startupper out in Silicon Valley. I've been doing that for the last decade or more. But prior to that, I actually was involved in the stabilization and recovery efforts with the U.S. government during the financial crisis in 0809. And so I was deeply involved in kind of stopping the world from falling apart, 15 years ago when Wall Street got into a bunch of trouble. And that experience, kind of working in federal regulatory bodies and, with private sector entities that were, responsible for the crisis and then, needing to figure out how to clean it up, is what led me to Bitcoin in the early days, right? And, it was a very, I was a new grad out of school and at the time. And, I was kind of stepping back to ask this question, like, why is the world falling apart? Like everything seemed awesome, just a year before, when I was in school, and, there was all this opportunity ahead of us. And then all of a sudden the whole world was melting down, and it was absolute chaos. And so, I kind of got involved. Obviously I was, kind of in the trenches doing the recovery work. And then through that process, and then, my own technical background, I came to Bitcoin and I discovered it, and I said, oh, wow, a public open ledger where everybody, can't cheat one another. Like, hey, this might have been useful right before we vaporized a few $1 trillion in, middle class wealth around the world. So yeah, that was kind of the, genesis for me of getting engaged in the Bitcoin community. And then at the time, the community was so nascent. I was basically just a political sort of activist in, trying to promote the technology and extol the virtues that it could bring to the, global financial system if it were widely adopted. But in order to figure out how I would be able to play a longer term role in this ecosystem, I ended up going to Silicon Valley. I've been very lucky to, build some very large companies out there and, kind of learn how the technology industry worked. And now I'm trying to bridge the gap and marry these two sides of kind of the world together, as as we said, AI and kind of the technology revolution that's happening in conjunction with the revolution that's happening in money and Bitcoin. These are converging waves that are going to change the entire face of society in the next decade and probably many decades to come. So this is a very important area. I have a lot of passion about it. And so, yeah, Save Our Wallets and now this Satoshi Needs You marketing campaign are kind of my love letter to the Bitcoin community after, more than a decade of kind of standing on the sidelines.
Fantastic. All right. Let's dig into the meat a little bit here. I'm gonna shift it over to Zach Shapiro here. Zach, curious where we're at on market structure legislation. There's been some kind of slow development. It seems like kind of a lack of clarity, not to not to use that too much, but kind of where we're at, what the timeline here looks like, and why maybe this moment in particular is of importance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a little bit of a slow moment in Bitcoin policy and kind of in Bitcoin in general. And I think if you are on Bitcoin Twitter, you're probably feeling that a little bit. People are finding maybe sort of less important issues to blow up into more important issues. Where we are in particular with the market structure legislation is that the Senate earlier this month put out a new draft of their companion bill to the Clarity Act in the House that passed through the House this summer and will pass into law if the Senate gets their version through. I actually think that the part of the Senate's version of the Clarity Act that deals with self-custody with developers of non-custodial technology and providers of non-custodial services is actually better than the House version. The House version, I think, got watered down a little bit at the last moment by specific requests from personnel in FinCEN. That did not happen on the Senate version. And so, I think it's maybe just worth reading the definition of what they call a non-controlling developer or provider. The current version of the Senate bill says that the term non-controlling developer or provider means a developer or provider of a distributed ledger service. And that is defined quite broadly that would include things that we care about, like Lightning, like eCash, like sidechains. A lot of tools are built on Bitcoin that in the regular course of operations does not have the legal right, which is something you can fix by just having a correct terms of service, or the unilateral and independent ability to control, initiate upon demand, or effectuate transactions involving digital assets which users are entitled without the approval, consent, or direction of any third party. So the key words there are unilateral and independent, and it is both. It's not either. So that's really helpful for federated systems. That's really helpful for decentralized networks, for multi-sigs. And I think that provides really good, robust protections. And sort of unlike the House version of the bill that passed, there is very little qualification in terms of the carve out for non-custodial developers and service providers. In the House version, it's you're not a money transmitter if you're doing, X, Y, and Z things. And now X, Y, and Z categories in the House bill are relatively broad and a huge step forward from the status quo. But the Senate version basically says if you meet this broad criteria we just mentioned, then you are not a money transmitter, full stop, explicitly calls out for the purpose of the Bank Secrecy Act, for the purpose of Section 1960, which is the federal criminal law that was used in the Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash cases. So this is like really sort of almost perfect on the wish list of how we would want this phrase from a legal perspective. Now, where we are in this is you need to get a bill through the Senate. You need a filibuster proof majority, which means 60 people in the Senate, which means you need to win over some Democrats. The idea is that the Senate would like to vote on this before the end of the year. So I think this is going to come to a head in the winter. And over the summer, sort of more quietly, there have been a lot of sort of crypto policy advocacy groups that have been in DC trying to drum up support for this bill. I think it is very uncertain whether this is going to pass. My sort of current, the way the weather vane is blowing is probably there's about a 50-50 shot. I think it really will come down to sort of moderate Republicans that are not on the banking committee, that don't really understand the subject matter very well yet, who maybe felt like they got dragged through the big beautiful reconciliation budget bill. We need to win them over, and then we need to win over a cadre of moderate Democrats who are sort of more national security focused, who I think are gettable largely by framing this as a sort of civil liberties issue, which of course it is. And we also know, that sort of two biggest dangers here. One is the anti-crypto contingent of the Democratic Party, so Elizabeth Warren and her camp. They understand that the peer-to-peer non-custodial transactions is at the heart of what makes crypto valuable and what makes it sort of different and apart from things the state can control. So they're going to come after this piece of the legislation really hard. And we also know that there is the sort of the main raison d'etre for this bill, right? The reason it's called the market structure bill is that the primary thing it is meant to do is not the section that I just read from. It is to basically have a safe harbor or carve out for token launches where you're not going to be treated as having done a securities offering for the first few years after you launch a token. This is hugely economically consequential to crypto exchanges, to crypto VCs, and that's where at least most of the immediate money is at stake, setting aside the fact that over the long term this is all going to be vaporware unless you can use it on a peer-to-peer basis. So the things to watch out for are, number one, a FUD campaign by Elizabeth Warren and company about national security threats, about how this is a total loophole that will remove what they call unhosted wallets from regulation. And then the other thing to watch out for is a deal, if it looks like this bill is in jeopardy of not passing, sort of between the crypto VCs and exchanges, where they sort of throw these developer protections overboard in exchange for getting the win that they sort of need in the proximate future on the securities versus commodities market structure angle here. And I think in order to deal with both of these threats, it is, the number one thing we can do is make sure that sort of we are informed, our voices are being heard, and to the crypto community that might sort of throw the developer protections overboard, we need them to hear our voice that this is really important to us, and truly that this is sort of upstream of anything that if they're serious about Web3, if they're serious about an ownership layer of the internet and crypto and Web3 revolutionizing the world, they need non-custodial peer-to-peer transactions to be legal. They need DeFi to be legal, and that this is a do or die thing. The bill should not go through without the developer protections. And for the policymakers who either just don't know a lot about this subject matter or are otherwise exposed to this sort of illicit finance or national security FUD talking points from the Elizabeth Warren camp, we need them to understand that this is a civil liberties issue, that we don't normally hold neutral infrastructure providers responsible for what the users of that infrastructure do with it, and that this is sort of a wrong-headed way of going about it if you're trying to throw developers in prison for what people do with their code. And I think on both of these fronts, what Kyle's doing with the Save Our Wallets campaign is really helpful and is exactly the type of activity we need to engage in, and probably more productive than a lot of the arguments that are happening on Bitcoin Twitter right now.
Kyle, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Zach did a great job, kind of giving the overview. I guess I would just say that this is one of the challenges that we find ourselves in, the Bitcoin community. A lot of people have an allergy to engaging in politics in the first place, and they don't really want to, engage with the state, so to speak. But, whether you care to take an interest in politics or not, politics will take an interest in you. And, this is a situation where we need everybody to make their voices heard. And all of these congressional representatives need to understand that if they do away with these developer protections and effectively kill the ability for decentralized, non-custodial software development and wallets to, exist in the US market, that it's going to sterilize the technology and it's going to sterilize the industry in the United States, because this is the fundamental transformation or revolution of the technology, right? This is something that big corporations are often fond of doing. They want to entrench, a regulatory regime or apparatus that, kind of pulls up the ladder and seals the markets off to new competitors, and kind of free choice in the outside market. And we just cannot tolerate that in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Ultimately, this boils down to, your right to transact in the way that Satoshi gifted this technology to everyone in the world and not just the US markets. So, what happens here in the United States will likely set the standard or the framework for the next 10 years, probably both in the US market and the wider, global market, because most of the world looks to the US regulatory apparatus as, kind of the gold standard or the, the yardstick to, build around. So again, I just think that it's critical to emphasize to everyone that while we have language in the current bill that's being debated, as Zach mentioned, Elizabeth Warren could broker a deal the night before the vote where they rip these protections out, and you might see large companies who have an interest in maintaining their own centralized technologies that serve this market say, well, we're okay with it. We'll take the token rules and, we'll offer our centralized services. But that would be, again, catastrophic for the larger market. And so, this is a situation where the job's not done. And, there's a funny subreddit of, premature victories that people may or may not be aware of. If you're watching this and you're unfamiliar, go take a look. But, it's people celebrating on the 5-yard line right before, they finish the race or they scored the winning goal or whatever, and they just fumble the bag or fumble the ball and, end up losing. We don't want that to be us in the Bitcoin community. And, we are, engaged in so many other ways. We determined the outcome of the last election. I think we're arguably the most powerful political coalition in the United States today, absent, a couple others that are, obviously exceptionally well-funded and substantially larger in aggregate numbers. But we need to make our voices heard, and we need to, do our damnedest to protect this technology that, again, we were graciously gifted 15 years ago on the brink of economic collapse.
Yeah, I think to put a finer point on some of that, absent the developer and non-custodial protections, the market structure bill is net bad for Bitcoin. The sort of main impact of the bill, other than that on Bitcoin, is it, for the first time, it gives the CFTC, which is the commodities regulator in the United States, authority over Bitcoin and crypto spot markets. So the CFTC normally, despite the fact it is the commodities regulator, it doesn't regulate the sale of spot commodities. If you're selling oil to someone, they don't regulate it. If you're selling gold, if you're selling wheat itself, the CFTC doesn't get involved. That's people selling stuff one to another. What they do is they regulate the futures and derivatives markets for those things to make sure that there's not market manipulation and they're fair. And then the CFTC sometimes has what's called ex post, like fraud authority over those markets. So if you are committing fraud, they can come in and police that after the fact, but they don't have ex ante authority over markets themselves. People who are skeptical of the crypto markets broadly see that as a loophole, right? To the extent that there are cryptocurrencies that are commodities. And, the part of the point of this bill, of course, to address which are commodities and which are not. So far, the only one we know for sure is a commodity is Bitcoin. It seems like probably the SEC has taken the position Ether is also, and who knows on the rest of this stuff. They think it's a loophole that those are not regulated by the CFTC or the SEC. And so they're aiming to, quote unquote, close that loophole by having them, the CFTC, have authority specifically over crypto spot markets. And so, absent the developer regulations, the bill flips from being like, this is the most important piece of legislation we need to be behind and make the most noise. It's the best shot on goal for sort of Bitcoin being freedom money, to, it's like moderately bad and we want it to die. So like this really is, something we need to be laser focused on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, another way to say that is this is Schrodinger's bill for us in the Bitcoin ecosystem, right? We're going to get to the 11th hour at the moment of the vote, and we're going to open the box and we're going to find out, is this critical and we're about to achieve victory that we've been waiting for 15, 16 years? Or is this poison that will kill the industry and we need everybody to line up against it and vote it down? And again, this is kind of, I guess, not to, it's up to you if you want to go in this direction, but this is the point of Satoshi Needs You, right? Every Bitcoiner needs to be paying attention to this bill and this legislative process, because you're going to have to cast a vote one way or the other as a Bitcoiner on whether this needs to go through or whether we need to kill it. And so that engagement is the most important part of this entire process right now.
In terms of what we want out of it, I think there's both a sort of instrumental aspect and then there's a sort of, I guess, intrinsic aspect. The instrumental part is we are not going to have peer-to-peer economies absent the developer protections, right? We need people to be able to build the tools that will allow the economic activity we want. And so this is a gateway towards getting to the future that we're working towards. And then the sort of like intrinsic part of this is if you think about what kind of sort of statement the government would be making by doing the opposite, by irrationally holding people responsible for the code they write. That's really troubling, just independent of whether you think the peer-to-peer outcome is worthwhile or useful or worth fighting for. Just the very act of having that kind of enforcement is sort of Orwellian and bad and doesn't make any sense and really damaging. And I think we take this in a couple of different directions, but the sort of two things that makes me think about that are pretty different. One is, and this part I don't want to go too much into, but I've been seeing some troubling sort of dialogue in the Bitcoin space. I understand there's a fierce debate about sort of what kind of node software to run right now, and I don't want to take a position one way or the other on that. But I've been seeing people say that developers in companies that build sort of assets on top of Bitcoin, ancillary assets, should be prosecuted for criminal behavior that people use because of an update to core. And not only is that just A, it's legally wrong, right? This is just a misunderstanding of the law. B, it's sort of absurd. But C, like, it's kind of an attack on Bitcoin, right? That is like pretty much exactly the behavior we're trying to stop here. And like, listen, Bitcoin it's an open network. It's money for enemies, and people can approach it however they want. But if you are rooting for the state to imprison software developers because they are using a different preferred consensus node software than your preferred, like, might be time to take a minute off and look yourself in the mirror and be like, all right, what am I fighting for here? The other thing it makes me think about, with our sort of every week we have an AI segue of one way or another, but there are going to be parallels in the way the state wants to regulate open source AI and even more open weight AI. And I think in some ways that's a harder case because people can just more clearly do damaging things with that technology. But I think this, like the way that we think about and frame this question now about where is the line between neutral infrastructure and then sort of criminal activity we're scared about, I suspect even outside of Bitcoin and crypto is going to be one of the defining questions of this century because of the way AI is developing.
Yeah, I mean that seems to me to be something that might also be convincing to policymakers is like, yes, we understand this is like the crypto issue, and we understand that the crypto issues, specifically for Democrats, is an issue that's challenging to engage with, but also understand that like the way that you regulate this has implications, like to basically every industry. This is something that Zach, you and I have been talking about for basically since these prosecutions went down, which is like this legal theory has no sort of logical end to it. Like it is exceedingly unclear how far this unlicensed money transmission kind of question goes. I mean, so I guess, one strategy that might also be successful going forward is like, hey, this is obviously like an immediately crypto issue, but this is also sort of a question that we have to answer, with broader implications. So
the legal question and the philosophical question, right? So the legal question is it's not necessarily specific to crypto, because if like the Tornado Cash government theory is so broad, you could capture messaging apps of all sorts that, arguably help people facilitate it, or frying pans or USB cables. We've talked about that a lot on the show,
Right.
but it is sort of specific to the Bank Secrecy Act, whereas the broader principle of where is the line between infrastructure and services, like that is much broader than the Bank Secrecy Act or any set of law. And that will be the same type of question that AI developers are going to have to face. And, with open weight models, people will be able to sort of jailbreak and reverse engineer. How do you engineer a deadly virus, or how do you make a bomb, and all sorts of things that like are genuinely harmful. And I think we do actually need to look those things in the face when we talk about this policy issue, and not pretend they don't exist because it's more convenient for us. But I think, like, aside from what I think is the easy legal question of does the Bank Secrecy Act apply to non-custodial tools, there is the harder question of like, okay, putting aside the statutes that are on the books, if we had a full sort of democratic debate about this, where do and should we draw the line? Is that different for different tools, or is there some sort of higher order framework we want to draw between, like, building infrastructure is sort of sacrosanct from certain types of regulation or criminal law?
Yeah, let's circle back to that at the end. Kyle, let's go to you here. Can you talk a little bit more about the Satoshi Needs You campaign? I think we've now kind of set the foreground for why the timing is now, but what exactly is it sort of aiming to achieve? And for folks listening, I mean, you're welcome to kind of direct people.
Yeah, well, we just launched the campaign last night officially at the Coin Center Gala in New York City. And so, it's now had exposure to, a good chunk of the, kind of policy and legal intelligentsia of, the Bitcoin ecosystem here on the East Coast. And we're going to be taking the campaign forward both to DC and rolling it out as well to all of the regional hubs that we can get our hands on around the country. Because again, the most important thing here is this is an actual grassroots organizing campaign to make sure that Bitcoiners get involved. Right. I've been, the genesis of this campaign, actually, I should say, to take a step back, was that, as I said, we started Save Our Wallets at the beginning of the year. Things looked like they were going well. We had the BRCA language incorporated in the Clarity Act. It passed the House, on a pretty healthy margin, and things were looking good. But then we made it to summer, and the DOJ prosecutions against Samurai and Tornado Cash happened. And all of a sudden, the mood got a lot darker, right? Because with no laws on the books, arguably we're now moving in reverse from, where we had been, prior to the Trump election or the Trump administration, coming in and saying that they wanted the United States to be, the global home of crypto. So basically, I just saw this disjoint that was happening where, your average Bitcoiner, people who are showing up to, the meetups, anybody that you would talk to in kind of like your normal life, they thought we'd already won. Right? Didn't Trump get elected? Haven't we won? I thought we won. Aren't we having so much fun winning that we're tired of it? And of course the answer was absolutely not. Right now it's kind of just vibes. I'm grateful, and it's, great that we have as many supporters, willing to say things in Congress and in the administration as we have, but we need them to actually do things. And this is, what precipitated the idea of the campaign. So basically, I just kind of took a step back and was like, all right, well, how do we create a viral marketing campaign to get people engaged, right? And feel a sense of solidarity with one another, and the need to kind of unite as a community and participate in this political process that we have going on here, in the same way that the Bitcoin community came together in order to help decide the direction of the last election. And so, the kind of mimetic framework that I fell back on was, the traditional piece of Americana, which is Uncle Sam Needs You. That silhouette is almost instantly recognizable by anyone in America, and frankly, most people around the world. And so we centered the campaign around, that as a kind of viral image, and the homage to Dorian Nakamoto, who is the, not Satoshi character from the early days of, the movement.
It feels a little bit wrong to use the term mascot, but it's something in that.
Yeah, it's adjacent. I don't know exactly what we would call Dorian, but for anybody who's been involved in the ecosystem for, a cycle or two, you're probably familiar with Dorian. And so we kind of merged these two mimetically sticky and, emotionally evocative images together in order to create this. And this has been a wonderful collaboration between all the different pieces of the Bitcoin ecosystem. So I initially reached out to the Bitcoin Design Foundation and was able to find an exceptional visual designer through the Bitcoin Design Foundation. And then once we got to the point of having seen where it was heading and getting really excited, I reached out to BPI and Coin Center as the kind of two leading policy organizations for the Bitcoin ecosystem. And now we're starting to build the big tent, right? So we've got Presidio Bitcoin, PubKey, Bitcoin Park, all of these different physical hubs around the country are starting to come together in order to make sure that Bitcoiners in the real world and out in meat space are actually, encountering this image. It's starting conversations. It's getting people engaged. Again, with the idea that, we just need Bitcoiners to pick up the phone or write a letter and make their voices heard on this issue. Again, we decided the last election by, if you look at the numbers, I think it's pretty clear we were a substantial swing vote in determining the direction that, the current Congress and the administration are headed. And, we just need to make sure that they continue to live up to the commitments that they made to this ecosystem and that they're being true to the values that they said that they espoused in wanting to, make the United States the global home and leader of the crypto industry. And in order to do that, we need a healthy and vibrant and flourishing Bitcoin industry in the United States. And we need that entrepreneurialism. I come from Silicon Valley. If Congress had stepped all over their own feet in trying to regulate the internet in the early days, if they had required that you get a license in order to start a website or to, create an application that was going to, be provided to average users and on the street, using the internet, we would not have the Mag 7. We would not have, trillions of dollars of economic wealth. I mean, probably millions of jobs, all of these things that we now, take for granted in the United States. So again, the idea here is like, this is pretty simple for Bitcoiners. You know what you need to do. This is, just get off the couch, or what, even if you're sitting on the couch, dial the phone. You just got to dial the phone and you can stay on the couch. But we need everybody in this fight. The freedom to transact is critical. It's a critical right that we, frankly, have kind of taken for granted for the last 15 years while we haven't had legal guidelines around this industry. And now is the moment. Now is the moment for us to drive into the red zone and put this ball, over the net or in the net or through the post, whatever metaphor we want to use here on the sport. But, we're this close to victory. And your congressperson needs to know that there's going to be a consequence if they don't help us achieve that victory.
Zach, the thing we hear a lot is, my politicians don't listen to me. They don't care about me. What do you have to say to that, as this campaign is basically, an effort to make sure that policymakers hear the voice of Bitcoiners?
Well, they probably don't care about you personally, unless you're, a relatively significant donor. I mean, unfortunately, that's the case. Maybe you meet them, maybe you're compelling, but the bar is not that they care about you personally. I think as a tactical matter, the first thing I want to highlight from what Kyle said is calling. I think the call to action here is specifically a phone call and not an email. Emails are easy to ignore. They're easy to generate with AI. And it's not the politicians themselves, but their staff, and we're talking about senators here, right? We're trying to get a bill passed through the Senate. Senators' staff do take notice of how many phone calls they get. And you shouldn't be an asshole on the phone. That can undermine the cause. But as long as, and you don't even need to be particularly articulate, we can do that for you. You just need to call and say, hey, this is important to me, and here's why, in whatever way works. And maybe you're persuasive to the staffer, but even if you're not, like, they are going to note how many people call about this issue, and they're going to use that as a proxy for what people in aggregate care about. And senators very much do care, not necessarily about you, but they care about what people care about in aggregate, as we saw in the previous election. So that's really what's going on here. And so part of it is just the sort of naked politics of demonstrating to your senator that people in your state who vote for them and who their party would like to vote for their chosen presidential candidate in 2028 care about this issue and that they don't want to be crosswise. The thing about Bitcoin and crypto that people have been saying since 2024 is there's really sort of a cell phone for the Democrats to do so poorly on this in the previous administration, because there's not really a great grassroots constituency for being anti-crypto, and there is a large constituency for whom they're basically single issue voters. And so reinforcing that point, I think, is really quite powerful. And if you're willing to take the time to call, you're putting yourself, in a small minority of people that really get to have an outsized impact, because your voice will implicitly stand for thousands of people. Given how like the base rate of people who call into senators' office is so small, like your vote, your call is sort of the equivalent of many, many, many votes. And so it does matter in that regard. And then the other thing here is like, most of the people voting against it, right? Like Elizabeth Warren understands the custodial, non-custodial distinction quite well. And because she is anti-Bitcoin and anti-crypto, she is going to go against it. She is in the small minority of people who are going to vote against this legislation or try and kill the developer protections. Most of them are not going to understand it, and they're going to do it because they don't understand it and they want to do a favor for someone else. They heard something from someone that it's bad, right? Some sort of vague reason where they do not have a lot of personal conviction on the issue. And if you happen to be in one of the states that has those senators, it's extra important that they know this is an issue you care about, to motivate them looking into it, right? Right. So they end up looking at the stuff that Coin Center puts out and BPI puts out, and asking their staffers to read up on this. The sort of biggest challenge here is going to be education. And so aside from giving senators the idea that this is something their constituency cares about, which matters even if they don't care about you in particular, you are also helping motivate the education that is a necessary prerequisite for getting this across the line.
One other thing I might add there is that, it can feel kind of scary if you've never contacted your congressperson before to like pick up the phone. It's like, hey, I'm calling the government, like to tell them to do something for me. Like, I don't know, and a lot of people, in the technology industry, let's say, or maybe not extroverts. But I want to reassure everybody that this is actually a very welcome thing from the perspective of, the legislators. I was at the Day on the Hill organizing event that, BPI organized a few months ago. And it was my first time sitting down with, Congress. I've done it in my local market out in California in the state house before, but I had the same apprehension. I was like, oh my gosh, the hot lights, like this is going to be hard. And it actually wasn't at all. They were very open to the conversation. And in fact, they were, I think, very happy to have somebody that actually knew something about the technology sitting across the table from them. Frankly, I might have been the first shadowy supercoder that, any of these people in the offices that I'd talked to had ever spoken with. They clearly just didn't have a really, good understanding of the industry or the market and technology generally. So I think it's both critical that they hear from people who understand the technology and understand its importance, because if they're not hearing from you, all they're hearing is FUD from the people who are, anti and like literally willing to paint with a completely inaccurate brush. And, lastly, I think I would just, plus 10 on Zach's point that, most people do not contact their Congress people with any regularity at all. If everybody listening to this podcast or the stream were to pick up the phone and call, it would probably be the most highly engaged issue on the Hill today, right? Or at any day that we all called together. I mean, we stormed the Capitol in June when we went for the BPI Day on the Hill, and we were the talk of the town that day. Right? Every congressional office basically had some Bitcoiner sitting in there telling them like why it was important that we get these protections. And it had a huge impact. So yeah, I want to, encourage everybody. This is not something that should scare you. It's really not that hard. They're going to want to hear from you. But to Zach's point, please be nice. Like if you have somebody who's on the wrong side of this issue, you should let them know that they're on the wrong side of this issue, but you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. All right. So, be respectful, don't go on a crazy rant and scare them off. We have people like you guys at BPI who are doing the hard work behind the scenes in order to, put the polish on, but they just need to see or feel that this is something that, average people in their districts and their states care about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think especially you know, as we mentioned earlier, right? Like there's the pro side and there's, a sufficient, group of people who understand this technology, right? We're very lucky to have Senator Lummis, who's, sort of supported our industry for a while. But we also have like very harsh critics on the other side, and namely, Elizabeth Warren, and you know they do great within their circles, right? Like Senator Lummis has, sort of influence in the banking committee, right? That's where most of this draft legislation has come out of. Senator Warren is also on the banking committee, and she has influence over, some of her Democratic colleagues. But there's kind of this like group in the middle that is really, as Zach was saying earlier, those are the people who we need to reach with this on both sides of the aisles. So again, if everybody who's listening to this, especially the more sort of geographically distributed that our audience is, the better, right? We're trying to reach senators regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, regardless of what committees they're on, and just, offer them details about this particular piece of legislation and tell them that you care. Because, for folks, I'm thinking particularly on the Democrat side, like they hear Elizabeth Warren being very vocal about this, and that is, as Kyle was saying, kind of what they hear about. That's the extent of their understanding of this particular legislation. And so if there's 20 people that call from their state, right, that like sends a pretty big signal, like, oh, this is something people care about in my state. These are the people who elect me, and it's not just Elizabeth Warren kind of fudding Bitcoin. It's people who have some kind of influence over an election, who actually like this technology, who want to see it flourish, and who understand it, right? It's not just like a bunch of speculators who are like, I want to see my Bitcoin go up. That's not what this is about at all, right? Um, so we're gonna kind of finish off here with the philosophical conversation, but before we do that, Zach, I'm curious. As we go into the end of the year, I think you foregrounded this a little bit, but how do you sort of foresee the conversation going with particularly the like Elizabeth Warrens of the world? Like, is there anything we can do to win them over, or is this kind of trying to find the people in the middle?
Um, well, we're not going to win over Elizabeth Warren. We're just not. There have been lots of people who've tried. Like this is her issue, and she's not going to budge. But we can make her message less potent. And I think really the sort of main thing is just education about what we're talking about. It's like, okay, part of it is on us not to sort of overplay our hand here. And sort of what I mentioned before, I think when you talk about these difficult issues of individual liberty and freedom technology, like there are costs, right? Neutral technology like Bitcoin is always in some ways a double-edged sword, and people will misuse it. And it's not like we like a lot of the stuff that's happening, on the dark web, and people do use it, for child abuse, and, in some cases have used it to fund terrorism, and like all that stuff is real. But we need to figure out what to do about that. And you need to balance, things like security and law enforcement on the one end, and sort of privacy and freedom and individual rights on the other. And we need to be sort of honest about, okay, like this is what the trade-offs are, and what is a reasonable way to draw that line. And if you look at most of the places we draw that line with technology, whether it's Section 230 with regard to publishing speech or communication on the internet, whether it was the deregulation of the internet in the 90s, the original crypto wars about strong cryptography, the sort of like lack of need for a US government backdoor chip on computers or USB cables or any kind of other sort of technological infrastructure. We tend to have this implicit line. I mean, I think this just is the philosophical question. And I think when you pose it to people that way, there are enough both Democrats and Republicans who will understand that and will not want to be the people who sort of crush technology, crush individual liberty, and crush innovation in the name of, in the name of what, right? What are you even stopping from happening, right? You can't actually force KYC on all non-custodial wallets because there's such thing as open source software. So like that's not going to work. Even if you somehow were able to do that, most money laundering money laundering doesn't happen using crypto. It happens using physical cash or dollars or gold or art or other things. But the money laundering that does happen, it does happen using crypto. Like it's a lot of times, I think probably the number one way it happens is people having fake accounts on fully KYC custodial exchanges. You just get a money mule, right? And the crushing non-custodial technology does nothing to stop that. Crushing non-custodial technology does nothing to stop someone from handing a seed phrase to someone else that has, 100,000 Tether in a wallet, and you don't see the on-chain transaction, right? It doesn't matter if there's a coin join or not, you're just not going to see the transaction. So you're not going to stop that. So the upside of this regulation is not there. The downside is palpable. The sort of theory on which this kind of regulation is based is inconsistent with the way we have basically the entirety of the rest of our legal structure with regard to technology. And it is sort of reprehensible both to sort of American broad sensibilities about individual liberty and specifically freedom of speech, right? Because we're, at the end of the day, we're talking about people publishing and running code. And I think if you're just sort of honest about that and you get people to understand it at that level, I think the votes are there. But you need to get people to care about it, and that's the challenge. And then you need to get people to learn about it enough to like understand what these trades are, and that's the challenge. But what I think the one real advantage we have in this conversation is that we're right. And I think the more people understand this issue, the more likely they are to be on our side. And that's not always the case. The real sort of ugly truth is that's not even always the case in crypto. There's a lot of stuff where if people really understood like how do token launches work, they might have changed other parts of this legislation. But this part of the legislation we care about, like we just are in the right here. And so the number one thing we can do to blunt the sort of FUD messages that are coming out is like more honesty, more information, more education, and then, at that point, trusting people to do the right thing.
Yep. Kyle, question for you here, and you're welcome to weigh in on that too. One thing that I guess we had been discussing a little bit before you jumped on the call here was like to the extent that this is a product of like us winning, right? Like to the extent that Bitcoin wins, to the extent that whatever the meme is, hyper Bitcoinization, happens, that there's going to be a natural pushback from the government. And so I guess the question here is like, to what extent do you think what we're seeing and what we might potentially see, or what we're concerned about with the sort of Elizabeth Warren camp, trying to squeeze this out of the market structure legislation, to what extent is that just like sort of evidence that like Bitcoin is succeeding?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're winning, you're going to have haters, right? I mean, that's kind of the way it works. People don't throw stones at people who are, not winning. So I would say that that's definitely an indication that we have traction and that we have momentum and that certain interests out there are concerned, about the fact that the world is changing and that people want change. They are demanding change, right? And again, for me, this is a very straight through line from the 2008 financial crisis to where we are today, right now in this market, right? I mean, I think that, Bitcoin is not what crashed the global economy in 2007, 2008. It was a solution or an answer to the, what happened in the private markets that already had their own regulation and their own actors and their own interests prior to the events that took place back then. So I would say that, yeah, we should take this as an indication that we are growing in our importance and our power as a political coalition, right? It's the first they ignore you and then they laugh at you and, then you win, all right, sort of, or then they fight you and then you win, right? So we're at that now they fight you stage. And naturally, I think that means that, the opportunity for victory is right in front of us, right? Again, this is a fight that we have been engaged in for many, many years at this point. It's a fight that I hope we don't need to be engaged in, for too many more decades. But I think a lot of us who believe in free markets, peer-to-peer technology, decentralized governance, all of these things that, again, are the true innovations of blockchains and, the technology that Satoshi bequeathed to us as an escape, from the old system that was, predatory and causing immense suffering among the general population. We have a responsibility to carry that ball or to carry that flame maybe and bring it to, its ultimate conclusion. Right. I mean, rewinding back to something Zach was talking about a moment ago. I mean, I think what's very interesting to me about, kind of anti-crypto coalition and the people who are arguing against this technology, I mean, we often say that if, cash were invented today, they would try to make it illegal. Right. The kind of overarching political direction of transit, let's say, in the post 2001 universe is an erosion of civil liberties at the expense of, a larger and larger surveillance state, ostensibly because this is supposed to provide security and, safety to the general population. But, in kind of Western civilization, right? I think it was Justice Blackstone who said, it's better that 10 guilty men go free than that one innocent man suffer. All right. And I think we've kind of lost a bit of that conception in America these days. And I think our generation is kind of the generation, and, the younger generations, the digitally native generations, that, have kind of come up in this era and seen the failures of the old systems and ways that were handed to us. I think it's incumbent on us to, stand up for these philosophical and moral guidelines that founded this country, and, that were imbued in Bitcoin as a technology, in order to, spread American values in the digital realm and to the rest of the world. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's always darkest before dawn. As we said, this is Schrodinger's bill. All right. We're not going to know which direction we need people to get engaged. But, the one core thing we know for a fact is that you can't sit this one out. Right. This is the war for freedom money. Right. We need to have this technology, and it's an idea whose time has come. So, I just want to encourage everybody here to, take energy from the fact that we've got haters, right? Like,
Yep.
the fact that we have haters means we're doing good work, and it means that we're doing important work. So don't take that, as extra weight to wear in this fight. Take it as a sign of victory. That victory approaches and it's near, and if we do what we need to do, we can, together make the difference. So yeah, with that, maybe I'll just say, I'll plug, I didn't earlier, but I'll, just plug, everybody should go to saveourwallets.org. We've got a zip lookup for you, so you can see all the contact information and necessary details for your local Congress people. We got a form letter generator if you do want to write an email, although as Zach mentioned, it would be much more effective if you picked up the phone and called. And yeah, I hope that everybody listening to this sees the campaign, the Satoshi Needs You campaign out in the wild. I hope it provokes conversations for, everybody in the community. And yeah, together in solidarity, I think we can create a better and more, economically free world for everybody in this next generation.
Yeah, that's awesome. Everybody saveourwallets.org. We'll get that in the show notes as well. And then there will also be a tweet from the Bitcoin Policy Institute, BTC Policy Org, and that will link to that. So plenty of ways to get to the information you need. Zach, any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
No, I think Kyle put it really well. I think as Satoshi said, virus and numerous, strength in numbers. This is something that is deserving of a grassroots campaign, and yeah, I think we have a uniquely situated community to get this done.
Don't trust, verify.
I love it. All right, well, that's it for this week. A little shorter rip, but very good nonetheless. Kyle, thank you for joining, and yeah, we'll see everyone next week.